When Anthony made his way back to camp that afternoon, his body ached and he felt drained of energy. Despite this, he found that his soul was surprisingly calm. As he approached, he noticed an elderly Native American man waiting for him. The old man greeted him. "Welcome back, young warrior. I have been waiting for you." Anthony was taken aback by the man's words. "How did you know I was coming back?" he asked. The old man simply smiled and gestured for Anthony to sit beside him. "I have a story to tell you," he said. "It is a story of a great battle that took place long ago." Anthony settled in beside the old man, intrigued by his words. As the story unfolded, he found himself transported to another time and place, lost in the vivid descriptions of warriors and battles. When the tale came to an end, Anthony thanked the old man for his time and wisdom. As he walked away, he realized that his body may have been weary, but his soul had been rejuvenated by the story he had just heard. Jeannie had left before Anthony, leaving him alone with a visitor. The visitor had a hard, weathered face with deep lines etched into it, indicating he had seen many years. Anthony's heart skipped a beat when he saw the familiar face. "Charlie Jim!" he exclaimed, overjoyed. "How, Eagle?" Charlie Jim's lean brown hand confirmed his identity. "Chief, the white man has not forgotten his Indian friend," Anthony said. "Eagle no same boy like mescal stalk. Heap big, many moon, snows on the mountain," Charlie Jim said, smiling. He touched the white hair above Anthony's temples, displaying both pathos and dignity. "Boy no more Charlie Jim," Anthony replied. "Eagle has his white feathers now." Jeannie laughed at the exchange. "You funny old people. You make me feel old too," she said before running away. Charlie Jim's eyes followed her, then returned to Anthony. "She same girl here, long-time sick man's girl?" he asked, using gestures to indicate the height of a child and the weakness of a man's lungs. "Yes, Chief. He her father. Dead. Mother dead too," Anthony said, pointing to the 2 green graves across the stream. "Ugh, no live good, no get well. Eagle sick man have brother him dead. Jim find 'em. Him dig gold no water dead. Jim find 'em heap bones." Anthony learned the tragic story of Jeannie's uncle from Charlie Jim. He found the pack of a prospector and a pile of rags and bones in a valley beyond the Cottonwood Mountains. Charlie Jim recognized the pack as belonging to the sick man's brother Linwood, whom he knew. Anthony trusted an Indian's memory. Jeannie's uncle had met his end like many wandering prospectors before him, succumbing to the unforgiving desert. Anthony felt a sudden rush of dizziness, and his vision was clouded by a red haze. A chill ran through his body as he imagined himself stumbling blindly toward a false mirage. The feeling passed, and he turned his attention to the few belongings Charlie Jim had brought for identification of the deceased. Among them was a tarnished silver belt buckle with an unusual design which caught Jeannie's eye. She recognized it as her father's, given to her uncle. Anthony nodded to the Indian, acknowledging that he had been right about the tragic outcome. Jeannie realized the terrible truth and was overcome with awe. Anthony comforted her with a hand on her shoulder. The buckle seemed to weigh heavily in her hands as she walked slowly over to her parents' graves. Charlie Jim mounted his pony to leave, but Anthony asked the chief about Oella. The Indian's eyes were somber as he lifted his hand to his heart in a solemn gesture. "Oella dead," he said in a deep voice. Anthony understood that she had died of a broken heart. He stood in silence at the oasis, watching his old friend disappear across the valley toward the Coahuila camp. The land stretched out before him, vast and lonely, as he contemplated the tragedy that had befallen Jeannie's family. The Indian maiden was a beautiful and strong woman with a calm and serene soul that shone through her dark eyes. She had fallen in love with a man who was not of her race, a wanderer who had come within her gates. But when he left, her heart was shattered, and she could not bear the pain. It was a mystery of the lonely wastelands where emotions ran deep and raw. Anthony felt the weight of her heartbreak as he returned to Jeannie. He knew that they had to leave to find a new home and a new life, and so he told her simply that they would pack for the long trail. Jeannie was taken aback, but then her eyes lit up with excitement. She was ready for a change, for growth and new experiences. They would leave at sunrise. Anthony was amazed at her sudden shift in mood. It hurt him to see her so fickle, to see her forget her dreams of yesterday. But he knew that this was what she needed, what he wanted for her. He had seen her innocent heart, and he knew that she was ready for the world beyond the desert oasis that had been their home for so long. As she flung herself upon him, he felt a pang of emotion, but he pushed it aside. She was still a child in some ways, and he had to be strong for her. He disengaged himself from her embrace, and his heart swelled with gladness at the thought of their future adventures together. He had been content with the life his burros had led at the oasis. They were lazy creatures, much like the roadrunners, who were happy just being close to the camp. But now it was time to move on, and he had to drive them back to their shady spot under the cottonwoods. Jeannie, the orphan he had taken under his wing, was ecstatic at the prospect of leaving. She danced over the sand with joy, not realizing the burden that lay ahead. Anthony had to remind her that they would need to climb the mountain and walk until he could buy another burro. As they talked, Anthony couldn't help but feel a warmth in his heart towards Jeannie. He had built a new family with her, and he was proud of her. But he also worried about her future, especially with young men around. Jeannie was dressed in boys' clothes, and Anthony knew that wouldn't do. He had asked her to sew and make dresses, but she had refused. Now he had no choice but to face the inevitable. He had to admit that he was worried about what might happen when they met other young men. Jeannie was suddenly shy and begged Anthony not to let anyone see her like this. Anthony reminded her that she had not cared before, but now she had to face the consequences. Jeannie quickly changed her tune, saying that Anthony was different and that he was like a father, brother, and everything else to her. Anthony was touched by her words and felt a little better. But then Jeannie surprised him with a question. Was he sorry to leave? Anthony was taken aback and replied that he was. Jeannie then made a heartfelt offer, saying that she would stay with him forever if he wanted her to. Anthony was sorry, but he was also glad that Jeannie was growing up and moving on. He knew that the future held great promise for her, and he was excited to see what lay ahead. Jeannie was sitting solemnly, and Anthony could tell that she had been thinking deeply. She spoke, "Wani, what I want more than anything is to have a happy home with a guardian and young friends around me. You see that for me, and I appreciate it. But a guardian and a happy home are all I want. I'll be poor, I'll have to work for a living, and I won't have you." Her eyes became misty, and she seemed about to cry. Anthony was taken aback by Jeannie's response. "Poor? Well, Jeannie Linwood, you're in for a surprise," he said, leading her to the door of the hut. He tore up the old wagon boards that had served as a floor and dug in the sand underneath. He pulled out bag after bag, which he dropped at her feet with a heavy thump. "Gold, Jeannie, gold, yours, you'll be rich. All of this was dug by your father. I don't know how much, but it's a fortune. Now what do you say?" Jeannie was pleased, but the significance of the gold didn't seem to register with her. "And you never told me? Well, I'll be rich, Wani. Will you be my guardian?" she asked. "I will until I can find you one," he replied firmly. "Oh, never look for one then. I will have all I want," Jeannie exclaimed. The last sunset, the last starry night, and the last sunrise for Anthony and Jeannie at the oasis were memories they would always cherish. As Anthony drove the burros along the old Indian trail, he reflected on the inevitability of the end of all things. He had seen that trail every few days for almost 3 years, and had always wondered when he would climb it with Jeannie. That moment had finally arrived. The light-footed Jeannie, reminiscent of an Indian, followed closely behind Anthony. She chatted ceaselessly like a magpie, only occasionally falling into significant silence. She gazed ahead, her bright face focused on the enchanting adventures that lay ahead, leaving behind the only place she could recall as home. Anthony, hoping to distract her, pointed out the dry and gray canyon. He explained that only a little water flowed through the white wash, and it never reached the valley but instead sank into the sand. He then directed her attention upwards, towards the foothills where gleams of white and streaks of black could be seen. "Snow, Jeannie, and the pines and spruces," he exclaimed. They made camp at the edge of the spruces and pines, taking in the sweet, cool, and damp air that was a welcomed change from the desert heat. The wind sang through the trees, creating a different tone than what they were accustomed to. Anthony unpacked the burros and set them free, confident that they would enjoy the rich green grass. Exhausted from the long climb, Jeannie rested on one of the open packs. Anthony, armed with his rifle, walked among the scattered pines and clumps of spruce. The scent of the forest almost overwhelmed him, yet he couldn't seem to get enough of it. The dark green spear-pointed spruces and the brown-barked pines, so tall and expansive, intoxicated his desert eyes. He was lost in his revelry, forgetting about the gun in his hands until he frightened a group of deer that were grazing nearby. Anthony's instinct to shoot kicked in, but he immediately regretted his actions. These deer were tame, unlike the wary, telescope-eyed mountain sheep. Anthony gazed down at the sleek, beautiful deer he had killed, feeling sorrowful. What a complex character he had, with such a contrast between the excitement and pain, the physical and spiritual, and the wilderness and civilization. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but it was there. After a hearty supper, he laughed at how hungry he had been and how delicious the venison tasted. "I'm not cut out for this life," he told Jeannie. "You'll always be Takich, the giant of the desert and the god of the clouds to me." Jeannie laughed and replied, "You'll forget about me in 10 days after you meet him." Anthony felt a pang of bitterness, but quickly apologized. "I know you'll never forget me, but it hurts to think of you being someone else's." Jeannie blushed, her first time ever, and Anthony was in awe. Luckily, Anthony had packed extra blankets for Jeannie, who had never experienced the frost before. As night fell and the wind picked up, she needed the warmth. Anthony enjoyed the chill in the air and the heat from the campfire. The next morning the sky was overcast with clouds and the wind was harsh. Jeannie experienced her first winter, and when she dipped her hands in the water, she squealed and quickly pulled them out. With Anthony's encouragement, she bravely washed her face and hands with the icy water. Anthony had no particular destination in mind, content to let chance and his wandering instinct guide them. They traveled at a leisurely pace through the foothills of the Sierra Madres, finding easy trails and good campsites, and meeting friendly Indians along the way. After 6 days of traversing the desert, they finally reached a wagon road. The road led them to a gorgeous country with soft, velvety green hills and narrow, pleasant valleys where clumps of live oaks grew. They passed by several ranches as they continued their journey. The terrain became less rugged, and some of it appeared to belong to vast ranches that were once the homes of the Spanish grandees. Late in the afternoon they saw Santa Isabel from a distance. Anthony turned off the main road in search of a place to camp. As he passed between 2 beautiful hills, he discovered a little valley that was all green with live oaks and brown with tilled ground. He saw horses, cattle, and finally a farmhouse that was low and picturesque, with vines covering the adobe style peculiar to a country that was first inhabited by the Spanish. As Anthony went towards the house, he saw several children who stopped their play to stare at him. One of them ran to the open door. White pigeons were flying about the roof, and gray rabbits were in the grass. Ducks were wading in the brook, and Anthony heard the cackle of hens and the bray of a burro. A column of blue smoke lazily rose upward from a gray adobe fire-blackened oven. Before Anthony got to the door, a middle-aged, stout woman with a child at her skirts appeared there. She was evidently a hard-working rancher's wife, and she had a brown face that was rather serious but kind, according to Anthony. He looked keenly because he was getting into the civilized country that he expected would become Jeannie's home. "Good evening, ma'am," he said. "Will you let me camp out there by the oaks?" "How do you do, stranger?" she replied. "Yes, you're welcome, but you're only a mile or so from Santa Isabel. There's a good inn." "Time enough to go there tomorrow or next day," replied Anthony. "I ain't alone, ma'am," Anthony explained. "Got a young girl with me from the desert. Wanted to get her some decent clothes before we head out where there's folks." The woman chuckled. "Your daughter?" she asked, interested. "Nah, no relation," Anthony replied. "I was a friend of her ma's who passed away out in the sands." "Well, stranger, you're welcome to stay the night at my place," the woman offered. "Thank you kindly, but we'll be all right camping out here. It's a nice spot," Anthony declined. "Traveled far?" the woman asked, her honest blue eyes sizing up Anthony. "Sure did. Been about 10 days crossing over them mountains," Anthony replied. "You fellas hungry? I can rustle up some milk and eggs for supper," the woman offered. "You don't know how much we'd appreciate that, ma'am," Anthony said, grateful. "And poor Jeannie here, she's been living off desert grub for too long. Your kindness means a lot." The woman promised to send over the food or have her boy bring it to them. As Anthony made his way back to their little campsite in the grove, He couldn't help but feel that this woman's kindness and empathy were just what he was looking for in the person he could trust with Jeannie. He knew it wouldn't be an easy task to find that person, but he was determined to keep looking. For now, he kept Jeannie's small fortune hidden and warned her to be cautious. Jeannie was sitting on the grassy bank, clearly tired but happy to be there. "I'll help out in a bit," she offered. "This place is so pretty, and the grass feels so nice and smells so sweet. Who'd you see at the house?" "Just some young'uns and a nice woman," Anthony replied, keeping the surprise of their upcoming supper to himself. As the sun began to set, Anthony set to work on preparing supper. He got the packs spread out, the fire built, and started cooking. However, he soon realized that he was missing some key ingredients: milk and eggs. He set the pot and pan aside and went off to find some wood. He came back carrying a large log of dead oak, struggling under its weight. As he looked up, he saw a young man standing on the other side of the fire, holding out a pan of milk and a bucket of eggs. The milk was spilling over the edges, and the young man was struggling to balance everything in his arms. "Hey, where should I put this milk?" he called out cheerfully. Anthony was surprised to see Jeannie trying to hide behind one of the packs, wearing an old cap that made her look like a boy. "My name's not Johnny," she snapped back. The young man looked a bit confused, but then laughed. Anthony liked the sound of his laughter. It was hearty and genuine. "Okay then, Sammy, it is. Come get this milk," he called out. Jeannie stayed silent, glaring over the top of the pack. "Look here, I can't stand here all night. Mother wants the pan," the young man said, growing impatient. "Boy, are you deaf? Say I won't eat you." "How dare you call me boy?" Jeannie exclaimed, her temper flaring up. "Well, I'll be darned," the young man said, surprised. "Listen to the kid. I'll call you worse than boy in a minute. Hurry up, kiddo." Jeannie made a sudden movement, spinning around and causing her cap to fly off. She got down on her knees, trying to hide her embarrassment. With her face exposed and fiery eyes and curls no boy would have, she looked entirely different. "I am not a boy, I am a lady," she declared, her voice trembling with anger and outrage. The boy gasped in amazement and horror, dropping the milk pan, which splashed all over and almost extinguished the fire. "Hello, what's going on?" asked Anthony, appearing from the oak trees. "I spilled the milk my mother sent," the boy replied, embarrassed. "That's too bad. No wonder there's so much milk. What's your name?" "My name is Eugene Blair, sir." "Well, that's strange, Eugene Blair. My name is Wansfell, and I'm pleased to meet you," said Anthony, extending his hand. "Now let me introduce you to Miss Eugenie Linwood." Jeannie only reacted by slowly sinking behind the pack during her initial introduction. Anthony was amused by her reaction, while the young man, who appeared to be around 20 years old, was overwhelmed with embarrassment. "I'm pleased to meet you, Miss Linwood," he stuttered. "Please forgive me. My mother didn't say there was a girl, and you looked like a boy." "It's all right, son," Anthony said kindly. "Jeannie did look like a boy, and I have been telling her that." "Now, if you'll excuse me, I'll go back for more milk," said the boy, grabbing the pan and running away. "Well, Miss Know-it-all," Anthony teased, "didn't I tell you we'd meet a nice young man?" "He didn't see all of me," Jeannie replied tragically. "What? With eyes like his, he could see right through that pack," Anthony exclaimed. "He called me Bub," Jeannie suddenly exclaimed, her tone changing from one of tragic sorrow to one of tragic resentment. "Bub! The first boy I've ever met in my whole life." "Why shouldn't he call you Bub?" Anthony asked. "There's no harm in that." "He apologized like a little man when he discovered his mistake," said Jeannie, flashing with anger. "I'd rather starve to death than eat his eggs and milk." With that, she stormed off into a nearby clump of oak trees. Anthony couldn't help but be amused by her reaction, but he also felt uncertain about how to handle her feminine emotions. Jeannie reminded him of girls he had known when he was younger. Young Blair returned with more milk, but seeing that Jeannie was gone, he quickly left. Anthony invited Blair to come back after supper, which he agreed to do. Anthony prepared supper and invited Jeannie to join him. She came reluctantly, with her eyes darting towards the green beyond camp, and sat Indian style. Anthony served her supper without comment, including a generous portion of fried eggs and creamy milk, which Jeannie eagerly ate, forgetting her previous disdain. After supper, Anthony explained that he wanted to talk to Blair and suggested they rest up for a day or two. Jeannie protested, feeling left out and abandoned. Anthony reassured her that she could watch the camp and that Blair would likely forget her rudeness and be nice to her. Jeannie glared at Anthony, torn between tears and rage, and declared that she never knew he could be so insensitive. Anthony tried to explain that nothing had happened and that Blair had simply mistaken her for a boy. It was as if the world had ended when she woke up to find herself in boy's clothes. Jeannie had to swallow her pride and wear them, despite not minding what others thought of her before. Anthony, her companion, tried to reason with her, but Jeannie was adamant. She didn't care how anyone saw her, except for when someone called her a name that made her uncomfortable. Anthony knew trouble was brewing with Jeannie, a wild creature from the desert once they entered civilization. He wanted her to be natural and pleasant with the people they met. She took his words seriously and moved her bedding away from the firelight to the edge of the gathering gloom under the oak trees. Young Blair appeared at Anthony's fire after dark and engaged in conversation. Anthony asked if they were ranching, and Blair replied that they were running a farm with hopes of becoming a ranch. Blair's father was away, and his mother helped run the farm. Anthony observed that the soil looked good, and Blair agreed, saying that the farming country around the valleys was the best. Ranchers were taking up the land, and there were only a few valleys left. Blair was passionate about acquiring 100 acres in a valley below them, but luck was not on his side. Anthony replied in his quiet way that one could never tell what the future held. San Diego was growing fast, and people were buying out the Mexicans and Indians in the hills. "Within a few years, any rancher with one of these valleys will be rolling in dough," said the boy, his eyes bright with hope. "How much land do you own?" asked Anthony. "My ma bought this here farm, 10 acres in the valley, which was about 90. But we lost the valley after my PA passed away. We managed to get by, though," the boy replied, a hint of bitterness in his voice. Anthony could sense that something about the boy's father had caused him pain. He asked about the farm, what they grew and raised, where they sold their goods, and how many animals they had. In just 30 minutes, Anthony had gotten to know and like the boy. "You're pretty smart for a farm boy," remarked Anthony. "I went to school until I was 16. We're from Indiana, Vincennes. Pa got the gold fever and we headed west. Ma and I found a more reliable way of making a living," explained the boy. "You like ranching, then?" asked Anthony. "Golly, I'd love to be a real rancher. There's not just money in cattle and horses, but it's such a great life. Being outside all the time. But I do get to be outside a lot, just wish I could do more for my ma and siblings," the boy replied wistfully. "I saw your little ones, and I'd love to get to know them. Tell me about them," said Anthony. "There's not much to tell. They're like little Indians. Tommy's 3, Betty's 4, and Hal's 5. He was just a baby when we came west. The journey was tough on him, and he's been sickly, but he's getting stronger," replied the boy. "You have a lovely family. How do you plan on educating them?" asked Anthony. "That's our problem. Ma and I will do our best until we can maybe send them to school in San Diego," said the boy. "When your ship comes in?" joked Anthony. "Yep, always hoping for that. But I'd settle for my ship just starting out so it can come back full," laughed the boy. He was a dreamer, full of passion and sorrow, yet had a clear head and bravery. He knew the challenges he faced, but didn't let them drag him down. Anthony and Blair were sitting by the campfire, discussing life and its many uncertainties. Blair asked if Anthony would be leaving for town early in the morning, to which Anthony replied that he would not break camp just yet, as Jeannie was tired and needed some rest. He hoped they would see Blair again before they left. After Blair left, Anthony paced along the edge of the oaks, lost in thought. He knew that Jeannie had heard their conversation and felt a great sympathy for her. She was like a child, facing new and bewildering sensations. Anthony wondered how he could help her. The next morning, Anthony found Jeannie up and puttering around the campfire, trying to show that everything was perfectly natural. Anthony could sense that she was on the verge of something big. After breakfast, he asked Jeannie to come with him to the farmhouse. She went along, but her step lacked its usual grace. They saw the children playing in the yard, Tommy, a chubby little rascal with rosy cheeks and blue eyes, Betty with her dark eyes and open countenance, and Hal, a red-headed imp with freckles. Jeannie offered to swing Betty in a hammock made of barrel staves, and Anthony went to chat with their mother. "Good morning, Mrs. Blair," he greeted her. "We've come to chat a bit and see your youngsters." Mrs. Blair smiled and greeted them warmly, wiping her hands on her apron. "We're so happy to have you here," said Anthony, greeting Mrs. Blair. Jean is at work. Would you like to sit on the bench?" As Mrs. Blair sat down, she noticed Jeanie. "Well, I'll be. Is that your girl in boys' clothes? Jean told me he made a mistake." "Oh, she's beautiful. What shiny hair." "That's Jeanie. I want you to meet her, and then, Mrs. Blair, maybe you can give an old desert man some advice," Anthony said. He called Jeanie over, and she came shyly but willingly. Despite her worn clothes, Anthony couldn't help but feel proud of her. Mrs. Blair's kindness quickly made Jeanie feel comfortable. After some conversation, during which Jeanie impressed them both, Anthony told her to go play with the children. "No wonder Jean spilled the milk," Mrs. Blair exclaimed. "Why?" Anthony asked. "The girl is more than pretty. I've never seen hair and eyes like that." "That's the desert for you, Mrs. Blair. Nature makes colors and life more vivid and intense," Anthony explained. "And this Jeanie, it's odd that her name is like my son Jean's. She's not related to you?" Mrs. Blair asked. Anthony briefly told Jeanie's story and how he came to know her. "Bless her heart, poor child. And now she has no family, no home, and no friends in the world except for you?" "Not one. It's quite sad, Mrs. Blair," Anthony replied. "Sad? It's worse than that. It seems to me, Mr. Wansfeld, you are family and friends to that girl. And let a mother tell you what a noble thing you've done by taking in an orphan for 3 years." "What I did was good for me. It was better than anything I've done before," Anthony said earnestly. "I would continue if possible, but Jeanie needs a home, young people, work, and the chance to live her life and learn." "I gotta head back to the desert," Anthony sighed. The woman nodded understandingly. "My husband talked just like you. He left to work his gold claims and sold our farm for the money. He always had to go back to the desert, and he'll never come home again. Yes, the desert takes many men, but I would give up whatever the desert means to me for Jeanie's sake if it weren't for the reason that makes it impossible," Anthony explained. "So now you're looking for a home for her?" the woman asked. "Yes. You said she's well educated?" "Her mother was a school teacher." "Then she could teach children. Life works out strangely, doesn't it? My daughter might end up alone. Any girl could become an orphan." "Mrs. Blair, would you be willing to take Jeanie or come with us to town to help us buy some clothes for her? She needs a few simple dresses and things, and I'm not very good at that sort of thing. And Jeanie doesn't know much. She should have a woman with her," Anthony requested. "Of course," Mrs. Blair agreed. "I'll be happy to go. I need to buy some things myself anyway." She suddenly had an idea. "Actually, I have a better idea. There's not much to buy in the store in Santa Isabel, but my neighbor, Mr. Hunt, has a granddaughter. They're city folks and have been somebody once. The granddaughter is older than Jeanie and has more of a woman's figure. I heard her say the other day that she brought a lot of outgrown dresses with her and didn't know what to do with them. All her clothes are fancy, not like what you can buy out here. I'll take Jeanie over there right now." Mrs. Blair got up, untied her apron, and beamed with kindness. She seemed to have acquired a more thoughtful eye. "You're very kind," Anthony said gratefully. "Thanks, that'll be great for Jeanie. She was dreading the whole clothes situation," Anthony said gratefully. "Psh, don't worry about it. Miss Hunt wouldn't take your money even if you offered. She's got class, I told you. And her name ain't Hunt, that's just her granddaddy's name. I don't know what her real name is except for when her granddaddy calls her Ruth," the other person replied. The mention of Ruth's name hit Anthony like a punch to the gut. It was a strange feeling he couldn't quite explain. "I'll be right out," Mrs. Blair announced, bustling into the house. Anthony explained the plan to Jeanie, who was overjoyed at the thought of not having to go into town and being able to dress like a lady. "He? Who's he?" Anthony asked dryly, though he had a pretty good guess. Jeanie, ever the shy and feminine creature, blushed and bit her tongue at the slip she had made. Mrs. Blair then led Jeanie away through the oak grove and out of sight. Anthony returned to camp feeling relieved and pleased, but also deep in thought. The stillness of the noon hour threatened to lull him to sleep, but he was suddenly interrupted by a loud call. "Hey, my ma wants you to eat with us," one of the little Blairs yelled. Anthony lumbered over to the house, where he was greeted by Mrs. Blair in the kitchen. Suddenly something white and swift rushed up to him. "Look!" it exclaimed in a high-pitched voice, twirling in front of him. The girl in the white dress with matching white slippers and a beautifully transformed face looked like a Jeanie that he had never seen before. But her golden hair with a glint of dark color was unmistakable. Her eyes were like the heart of a magenta cactus flower, expressing happiness in a way that was both indescribable and terrifying. She had acquired a certain feminine essence that was not present before. "Oh, Wani, I have a whole bunch of dresses," she exclaimed rapturously. "I put this on just to please you." "I am pleased, dear girl. I am filled with joy for you and for myself," exclaimed Anthony. He blessed the nameless spirit that had come to him the day Jeannie's fate hung in the balance. He saw her victory now in the light of her lovely face. Mrs. Blair came in, bustling with happiness. She was always affected by the happiness of others. "It's good we have dinner at noon," she said as she put dish after dish on the table. "Otherwise, we would have had to make do with very little. Sit down, everyone. Children, please wait. We have company. Jean, come to dinner." Anthony found himself sitting opposite Jeannie, who had suddenly lost her intensity but not her glow. She had softened, and the fierce joy was gone. Anthony watched her and felt a thrill of expectancy, realizing that at least one of her sensations of the moment was being conveyed to him. Eugene entered, his face shining. He had wet his hair, brushed it, and put on a coat. If something new and strange was happening to Jeannie, it had already happened to Eugene Blair. "Folks, help yourselves and help each other," said Mrs. Blair. Anthony was ready for that. "But we have room for one more, and I think Jeannie will be happy here. What do you say, Jeannie?" Jeannie looked up, her eyes bright with tears. "Oh, Mrs. Blair," she said, "you are so good to me. I will work hard and be so grateful." Mrs. Blair smiled warmly at the girl. "That's settled then," she said, "and Mr. Wansfeld, you can come to visit Jeannie any time you like. She will always be welcome here." Anthony felt a lump form in his throat. He had never met anyone as kind and generous as Mrs. Blair. He knew that Jeannie would be well taken care of, and he could rest easy knowing that she was happy. As they said their goodbyes, Anthony felt a sense of bittersweet happiness. He was sad to leave Jeannie, but he knew that she was in good hands, and he was grateful for the kindness shown to him and his daughter. As he walked back to his horse, he couldn't help but smile. It had been a happy dinner indeed. Another mouth to feed and clothe, but she could help. And she would teach the children. That meant a lot to me and Jean. "He would be happy," he said. "So I thought about it, and I've made a decision. With your consent. Now, Jeannie, will you stay and have a home with us?" "Oh, I'll be so happy. I'll try so hard," Jeannie replied, her voice faltering. "Then it's settled. We'll try to make you happy," declared Mrs. Blair, embracing Jeannie. Anthony was filled with happiness, but was that all he felt? What did Jeannie's quick look mean? The intense, soul-searching flash she gave him when Mrs. Blair said it was all settled. Jeannie's desert eyes saw separation from the man who had been her savior, father, and brother. One flash of eyes, then she was lost again in the idea of having a home. Eugene looked at her as his mother enfolded her, and Anthony's heart suddenly lifted to exaltation. Youth to youth, the wonderful, the calling, the divine. Eugene's look was soulful, full of strange, deep melancholy and dreamy, distant, unconscious enchantment. What had seemed mysterious was now as clear as the sunlight. By some happy chance of life, the homeless Jeannie had been guided to a good woman and a noble lad. Goodness was the commonest quality in the hearts of women, and nobility, in youth at least, flowered in the breast of every man. While Eugene gazed at Jeannie, she lifted her heavy eyelids and met his gaze. Suddenly she blushed sweetly and looked away at Anthony, through him to the beyond. She seemed full of a vague, dreaming sweetness of life, a faint smile playing around her lips, her face losing its scarlet wave for pearly whiteness, and tears splashing down upon her listless hands. The moment, with all it revealed to Anthony, quickly passed. "Jean, why don't you show her the horses?" Mrs. Blair suggested. "She mentioned that she loves them. Take her on a tour and show her everything. We can put off work for today." Mrs. Blair conversed with Anthony, inquiring about Jeannie, and shared her own practical plans. She then hurried off to attend to the forgotten children. Anthony was left to ponder the happiest and most grateful thoughts of his life. He knew that much good would come of this, especially during his lonely hours when he returned to the wastelands. However, that was the only thought he allowed himself. Anthony relaxed on the old wooden bench, relishing in his growing anticipation. The generous Blairs had no idea that by offering Jeannie a home out of the kindness of their hearts they had stumbled upon prosperity. They were poor, but Jeannie was wealthy. They intended to share what little they had with the orphan, with no thought that Jeannie might share her wealth with them. Anthony decided to purchase the 90 acres and the 100 in the valley beyond it, along with horses, cattle, and other implements for a top-notch ranch. Jeannie, an innocent and bewildered child, had forgotten about her bags of gold. Anthony planned to borrow Jean's horse and buggy the following day and travel to Santa Isabel and then to San Diego. He would find a good investment for the rest of Jeannie's gold, locate a reliable person to manage her affairs, and a trustworthy bank to handle her funds. It would seem like a fairy tale to Jeannie, and Mrs. Blair would be amazed and delighted. Anthony knew that Jean would fall in love with Jeannie, as he had seen it written in their unconscious eyes. Jean would have the chance to work on the stunning ranch his heart had always desired. For the first time, Anthony realized the true value of gold. It would be a golden harvest here. Lost in thought, Anthony barely registered the approaching sounds of voices and footsteps. Suddenly he was struck with a jolt of excitement as his eyes locked onto a familiar face, the same face that adorned the miniature he kept close to his heart, the beautiful visage of Ruth Virey. Chapter 28. "The foxes have holes and the birds of the air have nests," exclaimed Anthony, his heart aching and his eyes burning. Was it him who lay there alone in the vast wilderness? The endless desert was his home, and he couldn't help but wonder whose face was etched into the clouds and carved into the rugged terrain. His burros grazed on the sagebrush behind him as he sat, back against a rock on the high peak of the Sierra Madre Divide, staring down into the abyss below. What had happened? He had fled. And now, for the 1,000th time, he relived that fleeting week of pure bliss when he found Jeannie a home and fell deeply in love with the daughter of Magdalene Virey. Those first days were hazy and dreamlike, filled with the slow realization of an unconscious love and the joy of Jeannie's happiness. He vividly remembered the moment when he handed her the papers and deeds to her land, making her the owner once again, and when he revealed the future to a young man with fire in his eyes. But now Anthony was alone once more, lost in the vast expanse of the desert. He knew he had to keep moving, to keep searching for something that he couldn't quite name. The memories of Jeannie and her family were all he had left, and he clung to them tightly as he journeyed deeper into the wilderness. The inception of a love that rose like the blaze of the sun was vague, mystic, and troubled like a dream. It was as hazy as the opaque dawn of the desert. By day or night, whether he was working or idle, the lovely face shone in front of him. The face was pale like a dawn-hazed star, similar to Magdalene Virey's, with all its beauty but none of its passion. It was charming, yet it did not wreak havoc. The young girl had wide-open purple eyes, dark as midnight, staring at fate. Her voice was sweet like her mother's, but not mocking, and it haunted the man's dreams and lived in the winds. "And you are a desert man," she had said. "Yes, a desert man," he had replied. "There's a place I want to go someday when I am 21, Death Valley. Do you know it? My grandfather says I'm mad." "Death Valley. For someone like you, never go near that awful hell." The ghastly white pit and its naked red walls, the midnight furnace winds with their wailing roar, the long, long slopes to the avalanche graves. The torment of his heart, the tragedy he would hide, and the secret he must keep, and the miniature that burned in its place, they drew her with the invisible cords of life and fate. What he would spare her surged in the air that she breathed. She had come to him under the oaks, and once again, quitting her friends, drawn to the lonely desert man. "They told me Jeannie's story," she said, and her eyes spoke eloquent praise her lips denied. "And so her mother and father died on the desert. Tell me, desert man, what does Death Valley look like?" "It is night. It is hell, death, and desolation, the grave of the desert, yellow and red and gray, lonely, 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 silent land." "But you love it. Jeannie says the Indians call you Eagle because you have the eye of the eagle." Tell me, she pleaded, and Anthony couldn't resist her charm. They spent those first few hours together in a haze of sweet pain, their souls intertwined. But as the night wore on, he couldn't help but feel her eyes peering into his soul, darker than the darkness itself. Her mother's eyes, with all the glory and none of the shame, haunted him. She came back the next day and the day after that, and time seemed to stand still as they talked. He told her of the desert, his story brief and hard. "Ah, I would be a man," she declared. I would never run, I would never hide. Her words felt like a mocking taunt, too sweet to be true. She had her mother's spirit, and he couldn't help but feel the weight of her scorn. He lay in the grass, his face pressed into the earth until love, real love, blazed like the sun in his face. Everything was clear in that moment of revelation. And then Ruth appeared with her womanly form and her mother's proud, aloof eyes. "Desert man, I am lonesome," she confided. "My grandfather is gone again. He is chasing some new will-o'-the-wisp. Gold and mines, cattle and land, and now it's water. He has an ear for every man." "Lonesome? You. What do you know of loneliness?" Anthony retorted. "There's a loneliness of soul." "But you're young," Ruth said dismissively. "Go help Jeannie plan her home." Jeannie and Jean, two people with but one voice. They cannot hear or see anyone but themselves. It's a pity to invade their paradise. I will not. And oh, how beautiful the world must be to them. "Beautiful lands and greens and waters," Ruth exclaimed, her discontent palpable. "But I cannot live on scenery." "The joy around me is palpable, but it does nothing to ease the pain I feel. I lost my mother, and the memory of her departure still haunts me. My father, who once loved me as a child, grew to hate me as I became a young woman. It's all so confusing. She left with him to the desert because he was obsessed with finding gold. She had a debt to pay, and I couldn't go with them to Death Valley." "Have you heard from her since?" he asked. "Never," I replied. "And now I'm a woman. One day I'll go to Death Valley." "Why?" he inquired. "Because that's where they went," I said. "But nobody lives long in that valley of death." "Then why would you go?" "I want to find their graves," I explained. "Desert man, I was just a child when we were separated. I want to know what happened. She loved me so much. Sometimes I can't bear to live. My grandfather keeps me hidden away in lonely places. We rarely see anyone, and those we do meet he sends away. It's all because of me. Desert man, I'm lonelier than Jeannie ever was. She was like a bird living on the sun and the winds. But I'm not a child anymore, and I feel lost." Her brooding purple eyes spoke of trouble, longing, discontent, and a fiery passion for life. Ruth Virey's heart and soul were a heritage of need and unrest, and it shone through her eyes. She longed for love, though she was not aware of it. Like a leaf in a storm, she stood at the threshold of womanhood. "Talk with me, walk with me, desert man," she pleaded. "You were Takwitch for Jeannie, be eagle for me. Your eyes know the desert where my mother sleeps, where her spirit may wander. You soothe my troubled heart." The connection between Anthony and Magdalene Virey was undeniable. He felt understood by her in a way that he never had before. As he lay awake at night, tormented by his thoughts, he realized that Magdalene had risen from the depths of noble love for him. Through her love she had seen into the future with mystic eyes. Her love had guided him to her daughter Ruth in the vast desert. Was this just a dream or a part of his tangled life? Was it the inscrutable design of a higher power he didn't believe in? Regardless of what it was, his great love for Ruth possessed him fiercely and resistlessly, leading him towards his defeat. It mocked his struggles and flaunted a banner of noble love, passion, and all the things that women like wives, mothers, and babies represent. He had finally found his mate in Ruth. It was strange how he remembered Amy Carlos and the wild boy's love of a day. That love was poor, pale, wasteful, sinful, and lustful. It was just a little gleam. He also recalled the spell of Jeannie and the strong call of nature in the wilderness. However, Ruth Virey was the woman that he could win over. The truth beat at his temples and constricted his throat. Ruth was the flower of her mother's tragic longing to be loved. Ruth burned with that longing, and life was not to be denied. Magdalene Virey had given him this child of her agony. She trusted Ruth's fate in his hands, and she saw with superhuman eyes. Anthony felt a deep tenderness for Ruth that pervaded his soul. Of all the men in the world who could love her, save her, and content her as he could. It was not the thought of her kisses or embraces that plucked at the roots of his will. The rush of joy that had filled him with Ruth's love was like a wave, but it was soon replaced by a deeper, nobler feeling. He knew he had to save her from the same fate as her mother and from the danger that lurked in her own heart. The reward for his efforts would be the happiness of a home, a mother's tender smile, and a child's kiss. But the weight of his past crimes weighed heavily on his mind. He whispered to himself, his face buried in the grass, his fingers clawing at the earth. "I am a criminal. I am a murderer. I could be hanged any day before her very eyes." He wondered if even the notorious Collishaw, the human wolf, would recognize him. He prayed for God's help in his desperation. When he met Ruth again, she spoke of her friend Jeannie and how her happiness frightened her. She confessed her love for him and asked about his life in the desert. Ruth believed he had done many good deeds, despite his protests. He confirmed he would be leaving soon, back to the lonely land of sage, sand, and big dark hills. Ruth understood he would continue to help those in need along the way, as he always had. She reminded him of the nickname the Indians had given him, Eagle, and her tone hinted at a past mockery. Anthony had no answer, but he knew he had to continue on his path, helping those in need despite his past. "You have the eye of a desert wanderer, seeing far and wide," he began. "But what about what's right in front of you? Why waste your strength and manhood wandering the desert for the sake of unhappy people? You're a great man of the desert, but you could do more good here where there's more misery to be found. I know of someone whose heart is breaking, and you haven't even noticed, despite your eagle eye." She retorted, "Listen here, you brooding man. I never said you were great, and I'm not interested in talking about you. I'm worried about myself. I'm a spoiled, dreamy, passionate child, but I also have a mind and a will. I can overcome my restlessness and discontent. I cherish the memory of my mother, but I need to stop grieving. The past is gone. I need to learn to fight. I'm not a fighter, I'm weak. I give in to loneliness, sadness, and longing. I need to be a woman, someone who lives her life and makes it worth living. Everyone has their burdens, and I need to lift mine cheerfully and start climbing. I need to work for my grandfather, who needs my help. I need to love those who are in my life by fate. I need to fight the dark moods, selfish thoughts, and hateful memories. I need to work hard until my hands are bruised, even if it means using a hoe. I need to love the animals, birds, and all of nature so that when I meet a man one day I can love him as well. That's what being a woman means. I'm done being a beautiful, sweet, useless, and petulant girl. It's time to be something more." "Be a woman!" The words rang in her ears as she stood there, pale and shocked. She felt her eyes brim with tears and her lips tremble. She couldn't believe what she had just heard, and yet the man before her stood tall and unwavering, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "Stay, stay, desert man," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "and make me a woman." But even as the words left her lips, she knew it was futile. The man before her was not the kind to settle down and start a family. He was a wanderer, a nomad, a man of the desert, and she was just a girl with dreams of a future that would never be. And so he fled, like a craven in the night. Not a farewell to Jeannie, not a wave of his hand. He was gone, forever out of their lives. "The foxes have holes, the birds of the air have nests," cried Anthony to the listening silence. He lay there with a broken heart and magnified sight, a wanderer of the wasteland once again. Back to the lonely land where the limitless expanse of rock and sand was home. From the lofty divide of the Sierra Madres, Anthony gazed down into the void he called home. Beyond the gray sands and far beyond the red reaches, he saw across the California desert into Arizona and down into Mexico and to the dim blue Gulf. Home. All the years of Anthony's desert experience were needed to grasp the meaning of the stupendous scene. Only the mind of man, the thought of man, could understand it. And for Anthony it was home. A place, a world terribly true and beautiful and comforting, upon which he seemed driven to gaze and gaze, so that forever it must be limned on his vision and his memory. The day was one of sunlight and storm, of blue sky and purple clouds and fleecy white, of palls of swirling gray snow and dark veils of downward streaming rain. The Sierra Madres stretched out on both sides, with range after range ascending to the north in the power of slow, league-long mountain swells, until the old white-capped heave of San Gorgonio loomed against the stormy sky, overlooking the gray Mojave. To the south, the long, low lines of the arid arm of desert land sank like the undulations of a calm sea. Under Anthony, the foothills piled up, round and old and gray, with shades of sage gray, lavender gray, and lilac gray. These strangely gray upheaved hills were made of aged earth, dust, and stone. They lowered hill by hill with glaring gorges between them, solitary hills and winding ranges and clustered domes split by canyons and brushy ravines. These foothills extended miles and miles, reluctantly surrendering allegiance to the peaks above, moving downward as surely as the grains of their slopes, weathering and spreading at last in the sands. That gray Sahara flowed away and away with its specks of sage, ribbed by ridges of dunes. It swept to its center, the salt and sink bowl of the desert, a great lake of colored silt, a ghastly glaring stain on the earth over which storm clouds trailed their veils of rain, and shadows like colossal ships sailed the sandy main. To the southward it flowed level and shining, to rise and meet the blue sky in lucent spurs of gold and white. This landmark contrasted singularly with the Salton Sink. It was the elusive and shifting line of the Superstition Mountains, where the wind sheeted the sands and by night or day, like the changing of tides, went on with its mysterious transformation. These giant sandhills caught the sunlight through a rift in the broken clouds. The scalloped dark shadows dimly showed under the dunes. However, these foothills and sand plains were only the edge of the desert. Beyond them marched the mountain ranges. The earth was rugged and rough, marked by the flames of fire, the wear of time, the tremors of earthquake, and the stains of iron rocks. A mountain range stood tall and jagged, leading down to the Salton Sink. The storm clouds loomed above, gray and purple with rays of sunlight peeking through, casting an eerie light on the hard, dark mountains and the smoky atmosphere. The ridge that ran down to the desert looked like the shore of the river Styx, and beyond it the chocolate mountains sparkled in the sunshine, their canyons and blue hues a sight to behold. In the distance the mountains of Arizona rose up, shrouded in a mystical haze, a land of desert dreams. Towards the south a valley wound its way through the mountains, pale green and centered by the Rio Colorado, which flowed towards the blue waters of the Gulf. The horizon of Arizona was marked by a pale wall of sky, a strange sight to see. Was it the oblivion of sight, the vastness of the heavens? Anthony gazed at it, his eyes piercing the constant haze until he saw the ghostly mountains of Mexico, faint and doubtful, then lost in the vastness of the Sonoran Desert. "That's my home," he cried to the winds. Tears filled his eyes, and he closed them, resting his gaze. A strange peace washed over him, a sense of understanding and acceptance of the desert. The wind moaned softly in the rocks, and the burros behind him nibbled at the brush. An eagle cried out in the distance, a wild whistle of freedom and solitude. One of the burros brayed loudly, jarring the silence. Anthony's senses were alive with the discordant sound that surrounded him. It brought both joy and pain to his heart as he remembered a time long ago, or perhaps just yesterday, when the desert landscape had been transformed before his very eyes. The sun blazed down on him, but it was the glory that dwelled in the clouds and the expanse of the blue sky that left him awestruck. He saw silver-edged rents, purple ships sailing through a sea of gold, and long fan-shaped rays of sunlight that seemed to stretch across the sky. White rainbows of haze extended from the north and seemed to bridge the gap between heaven and earth. It was a peacefulness that filled him with a sense of wonder, a deep and tender blue light that seemed to touch his soul. As he looked down, he saw the mirror of the earth reflecting back at him. The sun-fired ranges glowed like chased and beaten gold, and the entire desert was laid with shining jewels that sparkled in the sunlight. Mountains of porphyry marched down to the sands, while rocks of bronze red burned down to the sands below. The white columnar pillars of the clouds seemed to be reflected in the desert, slowly gliding across the lucent wastes. The mosaic of mountain and plain had its mirage in the sky, as above and below worked the alchemy of nature, mutable and evanescent. The dying of day, the passing of life, all of it was on display before him, and he couldn't help but feel humbled by the beauty of it all. Chapter 29. As Anthony made his way into the desert, he felt a newfound sense of purpose. With each step closer to the canyon pass in the chocolates, his eagerness grew stronger. He had been drawn to the memory of the camp where he had once fought starvation for years, unable to shake its hold on him. Anthony was exhausted from constantly delving into the depths of himself, attempting to understand his nature, heart, and soul. He was always searching for answers, but it seemed that for every mystery he solved, a deeper one presented itself. Despite this, the pull of the old camp was irresistible, and he knew that something awaited him there. The daily tasks and travels that had become so routine for him did little to distract from his thoughts. As he walked through the desert, Anthony's mind kept circling back to the past. He was getting closer to the place where his life had changed forever. Every step he took brought him closer to the terrible deed that had colored his life with bitterness. It took him 4 days to cross the sandy basin from the Sierra Madres to the Chocolates, with 2 of his camps being dry. On the 5th day in the afternoon, when the long shadows had started to stretch out from the mountains, he climbed the familiar slope where Charlie Jim had lured the antelope and looked down into the oasis where he had almost died of starvation and where Oella had saved his life. It filled him with joy to see that the gray-green, lonely scene was exactly the same as he remembered it. Time had made little or no change in the oasis. Nature worked slowly in the desert. His burros scented the water and trotted down the sage bank, bobbing their packs and kicking up little puffs of dust. Anthony stood still and gazed at the scene for a long time. He seemed almost ready to take a deep breath of melancholy joy. Then he descended to the sandy, rock-studded floor of the canyon and on the wide white stream bed where, as always, a slender stream tinkled over the pearly pebbles. It was strange that he had fallen into the exact course where he had once worn a trail. The flat stones he stepped on were as familiar as if he had walked on them yesterday. But time had changed things inside the palm grove. The thatched huts were gone, and the open places were overgrown with brush. No one had lived in the oasis for many years. Anthony pitched camp leisurely, feeling a sense of comfort and pleasure at the thought of staying there permanently, or at least for an indefinite period. This was the loneliest camp he had ever made in the desert. He named it the Lost Oasis. Here he could spend days and weeks basking in the sun like a lizard, feeling the weight of his solitude and listening to the silence. He would climb to the highest points and dream, watch, and relive those incredible revealing moments when he returned to the wild. After finishing his work and meal, and with the sunset illuminating the sky, Anthony would wander through the willows and along the stream. He would stand for a while, gazing down at the sandy bar where he had been bitten by a rattlesnake in the face while chasing it. Then he would move from one familiar place to another, finally sitting in the twilight under the palms where Oella had brought him back to life and strength. Where was she now, that tranquil, somber-eyed Indian woman who had refused to marry anyone from her tribe and had died of a broken heart? The twilight felt prophetic, and the rustling palms seemed to whisper. Anthony's return brought both sadness and joy, but that nameless something, that vague sense of contentment, the end of that restless feeling of always seeking and searching, seemed to be just out of reach. Maybe tomorrow. He was tired from his long journey, and it would take some time to adjust to the loneliness once again. The perfect peace of solitude had not yet returned to him. His mind was too full to focus on seeing, listening, and feeling the harmony of the desert. Yet something was beginning to come between memories of the past and the present. When he lay down in his blankets to hear the soft rustle of the wind in the palms and see the mesmerizing stars, he realized that they were the same as always, but that he himself had changed. The next day Anthony made his way up to the mountaintop where he had spent countless hours hunting mountain sheep and learning the ways of the land from the Indians. The climb was invigorating, and he relished in the cold, crisp air that filled his lungs. With piercing eyes he gazed out at the world below, feeling a sense of wild elation wash over him. He spent hours up there, alone like an eagle perched on a crag. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Anthony made his way back down the mountain, feeling a sense of regret wash over him. He couldn't quite put his finger on what he was missing, but he knew that something was eluding him. As he walked along the rim of the slope above the oasis in the dimming light, he watched the sunset fade over the desert. He wondered what it would be like to be lost down there without food or water. Would he panic? Perhaps, but only until he was certain that death was his fate. Then he knew he would find the strength and peace to meet his end. But what a terrible thought it was to die alone down there, to breathe his last breath under the starlit sky, bidding farewell to the beauty of life and the memories of love. The thought was almost too much to bear. And yet there was something alluring about the idea of facing death out there on the lonesome desert. It would be elemental and natural, a strong man's farewell to life. But the moment of facing death would be a sad and lonely one, a tragedy that countless men had faced before him. Anthony knew that not all men felt the same about death. Perhaps the strongest and bravest among them suffered the least. But for him, the thought of facing death alone on the desert sands was a daunting one, filled with both fear and wonder. Anthony believed that looking up at the indifferent sky and crying out hopelessly across the desert, knowing the end was near and remembering the faces of loved ones would cause his heart to burst. Life was too short and hope and love felt futile. Family, especially a brother, should be cherished and lived for with all the power of one's blood and mind. Friends should be held dear. It was a realization that every man needed to have. A crescent moon, beautiful and bright, rose above the dark mountain. Anthony paced back and forth in a sandy glade in the oasis, feeling overwhelmed by the vastness of the desert and the infinity of the sky. The stars shone bright and white like the eyes of heaven, watching and wise yet remorseless. Not a single leaf or blade of grass moved under the palm trees. Nature seemed so strange and beautiful, waiting for something. Was it waiting for him? The shadows on the white sand told Anthony's story of wild youth, crime, flight, agony, passion, and love. The low chirp of insects sounded so sad. Anthony paced there for a long time, thinking thoughts he had never had before and feeling things he had never felt before. He realized the brevity of life, the soul of sorrow, the truth of nature, the sweetness of women, the glory of children, the happiness of work and home. Something charged the air around Anthony, and something surged deep in his soul. What was the meaning of it all? Anthony's soul trembled on the verge of a great lesson that had been hidden from him all these years, and was now beginning to dawn upon him in the glory of the firmament, in the immensity of the earth, in the sense of endless space, in the meaning of time, and in the nothingness of man. Suddenly a faint coldness, not of wind nor of chill air, but of something intangible, stole over Anthony, and he shivered. He had felt it before, but never this intense. The feeling of loneliness vanished as he looked around, not frightened but unsure of the unnatural sense he felt. His tall shadow stretched across the sand, walking beside him. Was there a spirit keeping up with his steps? Anthony went to bed feeling disturbed. When he woke up, he had heard whispered words from Jeannie's mother and Ruth Veary in his dreams, reminding him of the immortal life of the soul of God and to never run or hide. His conscience tormented him, and he felt driven to wander the desert. He spent the day on the heights, hoping to shake off his consciousness, but the haunting whisper in the wind and the invisible spirit kept pace with him. Eventually he faced south and saw Picacho, the peak under which his brother was buried. Anthony cried out in terror, feeling the sharp pang in his breast as he was drawn towards the place that called him. There was no rest, no peace. He was a civilized man with a living flame of a soul, and only in rare moments could he forget the burden he carried. He received the call and knew he had to go. He had been wandering aimlessly, but all his steps led him back to the scene of his crime. He finally realized that he was being summoned by a force he couldn't name, but he felt it charging the air around him. This realization made him feel savage, and he felt a surge of strength in his body that overpowered his mind. His heart, blood, pulse, and nerves were all on fire, and he was ready to fight for his freedom and his life. He felt like he was in the grasp of a giant from another age, but he fought back with the same ferocity he had used to survive thirst, starvation, loneliness, and the dangers of the desert. He had already overcome the deep and powerful instinct of love for Jeannie, and the noble emotion of love and happiness for Ruth. But those seemed like nothing compared to the hell that was raging inside him now. He was fighting for his life, and he was like a wild and hunted creature, roaming the mountain top and halting at old resting places to sit like a stone, lie on his face, writhe, fight, and cry in torment. As the sun set, he staggered down the trail, exhausted and haggard, and tried to do some tasks that were meaningless to him. Food tasted bland, and sleep was impossible. The next day was the same, and the day after that, until he finally reached his breaking point. The physical effort had worn him out, and he was still locked in a deadly grip with himself, but he knew that his conscience would have to rise supreme, or he would be forever debased. On a clear night, Anthony found himself in an oasis that exuded a calming atmosphere. It was ironic that he had to turn to nature to find the strength to save himself from his own inner demons. After all, he was a product of nature that was born with the same fierce instinct as a wolf. The half-moon illuminated the cloudless sky, and the white stars sparkled brightly. The air was still, and the palm trees hung low, casting shadows of ambiguous shapes. The horizon stretched into the unknown, disappearing into the vast wilderness. It was a peaceful and serene night, with only two sounds breaking the silence: the melancholic notes of a nighthawk and a faint moan from the desert. The desert appeared like a massive river, slowly flowing down the earth's surface towards a faraway destination. Its low moan was a testament to its immutable power and dominance over the world. A spirit from the infinite above seemed to whisper to Anthony's soul, reminding him of his inner turmoil, and he was being conquered by it. Ruth Virey, a woman of great will and strength, had refused to hide, and her words echoed in Anthony's mind. Women like Ruth were all heart, transcending men in love, sacrifice, and a fiery spirit that could not be extinguished. In that moment, Anthony knew that he could no longer hide from the world. He must face his punishment and stand tall in his own consciousness, even if it was only for a moment. He had to be worthy of Ruth's love and free like an eagle soaring in the sky. The love of that girl with the striking purple eyes had served as a motivating force for Anthony. However, it was not the only factor that helped him overcome his fear. There was another force at play, one that was not physical or emotional. It was a pure, passionless, spiritual force, drawing him towards a direction like a compass needle pointing to its pole. Anthony wondered what this force was. Was it the faith that Jeannie's mother had in God? Was it something godlike within him that conflicted with nature? Or was it the mysterious progression of life that either raised men up or brought them down? Anthony's mind was shrouded in darkness, and his soul seemed like an abyss. However, he felt like there was a light about to illuminate his being. He couldn't understand what made a man great. What did it mean to be great? The beasts of the desert and the birds recognized greatness in strength, speed, ferocity, and tenacity of life. The Indians worshipped greatness, looking up and praying to their gods. They revered stature, power, skill of hand, fleetness of foot, and, most importantly, endurance. They believed that their great chieftains possessed wisdom, but above all they valued endurance. To endure pain, heat, shock, and all the hardships of the desert and life was their symbol of greatness. Anthony aspired to nothing more than endurance and the ability to overcome the challenges of life. He believed that any man could be great if he chose to endure and surmount the ills of life. In any aspect of life, one must face the inevitable fight. Endurance, hard work, and silent suffering are all part of the journey. You must stand strong, even with bloody bruises and broken bones. Bite your tongue and hold back the gasp, plodding on down the trails or roads or streets, staying true to your ideals. Endure misfortune, loss, defeat, and grief. Rise above anger, smile through tears, resist disease and evil men and base instincts. Love and hate with passion and seek glory and dreams. Keep pushing forward, even when death seems like a better option. Look up with unquenchable faith in something greater than yourself. This is what it takes to be great. As midnight approached, Anthony wandered among the palms. The desert was dim, gray, and cool, with a spectral rustling and whispering that seemed to echo his mood. The familiar sounds of the oasis were there, but they felt different. Midnight was haunting, and the vast, dark, and strange desert resembled his soul, his destiny, and the mystery of himself. The loneliness and solitude of the oasis brought him peace. He could be himself with only nature and spirit watching over him in this final hour of extremity. Happiness wasn't necessary, and self-indulgence wasn't essential to life. Anthony realized he had done wonderful, perhaps noble things, but nothing great. All his agony may have been preparation for this supreme ordeal. It would be a glorious sight to see a man rise up from the depths of his troubled past and use his newfound strength for noble purposes. This man would have been through it all: the blinded love of brother, the weakness of will, the sting of infidelity, and the tragic deeds that followed. He would have experienced the long and torturous hardships of the desert, the strife and the contact with wild souls. But despite all of this, he would rise up and use his newfound ferocity to achieve great things. He would climb beyond his nature and sacrifice himself to the old biblical law of a life for a life. He would have faith in the unknown future and lend his spirit to the progress of the ages. Anthony knew that he could not live a selfish life. His ideals were much higher than that. He believed in sacrifice and knew that he had to put an end to the evil within him. His love for Ruth Virey had shifted the value of his life. He knew that life was sweet, but only if he could live without hiding under the ban of crime. He had come to this realization through torments innumerable. He had deceived himself by loving life, but the truth within him was the truth of the immortality of his soul. He knew that he had inherited instincts of the savage, but he was determined to overcome them. Life was about renewal, and every base and selfish man held back its spirituality. Anthony cried out, "No more, no more," as he looked up into the sky. With a loud cry, he embraced the spirit of life that pulsed in the darkness. He heard the whispering voice of Jeannie's mother, felt the love of Ruth that he could never have, and struggled with his own instincts. Even more difficult was the fight he waged against himself as he renounced his desires. He accepted these challenges on faith as his personal belief in God. "I'll sacrifice myself for my brother," he declared. "I'll punish myself for my wrongdoing. I'll offer my body to save my soul." Chapter 30. Anthony sauntered through the picturesque Palo Verde Valley, taking in all its beauty. Eventually he reached the vast desert slope that led to the Rio Colorado. He gazed tranquilly and sorrowfully at the majestic river, which flowed red and surly between its broad green borders towards the colorful peaks that he remembered so well. All day he trailed behind his faithful burros, sometimes high on the river bank where he could observe the somber flood rolling southward, and other times low in the willow-shaded path. Though he appreciated the green, arid hideouts and the extensive winding valley, he seemed to see his boyhood and home scenes most vividly. The memories rekindled the love he had for his brother Carl. He was back at the old village school, high on the grassy hill, wild and cheerful, playing games and following his idol's footsteps. The miles slipped away under his tireless stride. Hour by hour he hastened his pace, and when the sunset signaled him to camp, he could see the grand purple bulk of old Picacho emerging in the sky. Twilight, dusk, night, and the solitary campfire. He heard the sullen gurgle of the river in the weeds, and he saw the trains of stars mirrored along its swirling surface. A killdeer, the most melancholic of birds, echoed his plaintive, lonely cry. As the shooting star streaked across the dark sky, a gentle wind rustled the leaves and carried away the ashes from the glowing embers. The flickering shadows danced like eerie specters in the darkness. Anthony gazed out at the rolling river, knowing that, like all things, it would eventually die and be reborn elsewhere. He watched the stars as they continued their grand and blazing task. On the third day, Anthony turned under the red bluff and entered the basin of Picacho. The trail had become overgrown and difficult to follow, with few cattle tracks to guide him. The willow and mesquite flat had grown denser and wilder, with fewer crisscrossing trails. Anthony slowed his pace and skirted the thicket until he reached the bank of bronze rock that had flowed down from the peaks long ago. The ocotillas were still there, with their pearly gray, soft green, and vivid scarlet hues, just as they had been when he had plucked a flower for Amy's hair. He was glad to see them, for they reminded him of the past. The crucifixion tree and the Palo Verde still stood side by side, where Amy had once told him their legends. Nothing had changed in all the years that had passed. The smoke tree and the green tree still raised their delicate, exquisite, leafless foliage against the blue sky, hiding the harshness of the desert. Anthony lingered here, knowing that his wandering steps were coming to an end. He gazed across the river at the wilderness of Arizona peaks, feeling as though he knew each one intimately. The sculptured turrets of Picacho were crowned in gold, and the shadows, hazes, and rays streamed down from the sheer, ragged bluffs of the purple mass into the valley below. A beam of golden light shone through the weathered hole in the rim, casting a solemn and majestic shadow over the towering mountain. Its grandeur and strength were palpable, and Anthony couldn't help but be moved by the wildness and beauty of it all. For a moment he felt like a savage, sensing but not thinking, as he absorbed the color and glory of his surroundings. Then, as if responding to a call, he made his way slowly and laboriously down to the river. The once open bank was now covered in greenery, save for a narrow sandy path. The dock was gone, replaced by a sunken barge and 2 leaky skiffs. Anthony remembered a prospector telling him that the mill had been moved to the mine under the peak, and realized that trade and traffic must now come and go by way of Yuma. As he drove his burros down the sandy aisle, he caught a glimpse of an old adobe wall, gray and worn through the mesquite trees. His heart stopped as he approached Carlos's house, now a roofless ruin with vacant windows and crumbling walls. The shed where he had slept was half hidden by mesquites, its ocatilla poles bleached and rotten. Silent and mournful, Anthony stood in the midst of the ruins, feeling the weight of the past and the inevitability of change. As he made his way back to the lane, he saw only old stone walls where once there were houses. The world he had known was gone, and he was left with nothing but memories and a sense of loss. In the distance, beyond the trees and up the slope, he spotted the ruins of a dismantled mill. It looked out of place and ruined the majestic view of the slope. His sharp senses picked up the scent of smoke before he saw the blue columns rising through the greenery. As he passed a plot of sand-mounded graves, a sharp pain pierced his heart. The graves were marked with rough stones, and one had a single wooden cross that was weathered and slanted away. Anthony bent down to read the lettering M.A. and quickly stood up. Further ahead he saw a cluster of low, squat houses, some of them new, but most of them he remembered. A post office sign marked the village as Picacho. The stone-fronted store looked the same as before, and the loungers there seemed to have never moved from their spots in the last 14 years. However, the faces were unfamiliar. From the group, a lean old man detached himself and hobbled towards Anthony with his cane in the sand. "Well, stranger, howdy. You down from upriver?" His voice twanged a chord of memory. It was Singleton. Anthony's emotions rose slowly as he peered into the old man's narrow, half-shut eyes and sunken cheeks. "Howdy, friend," replied Anthony. "Yes, I come from up the river." "Strange in these parts, I reckon?" "Yes, but I was here years ago." "I knew you was strange because you come in by the river. Travelers nowadays go around the mountain. Prospectors never come anymore. The glory of Picacho has faded." "Aren't they working the mill?" Anthony asked quickly. "Haw, haw. The mill will never grind with ore that is gone. No work these last 5 years. The mill has rusted out and fallen to ruin, and the gold of old Picacho is gone. But stranger," she hummed while she lasted. "Millions in gold, millions in gold." Singleton wagged his lean old head and chuckled. "I once knew a man named Carlos around here. Whatever happened to him?" "Carlos? Oh, yeah, I remember him. I was the watchman at the mill, and he was the boss of the gang. His daughter was killed by a guy named Felix. Carlos left town 10 years ago, and he hasn't come back since." "His daughter? Is that her grave over there? The one with the wooden cross on the sunken mound of sand?" "Yeah, that's Amy's grave. She was a pretty girl who loved men a bit too much. Some people say she got what was coming to her." The broad river sparkled yellow as it flowed through the breaks in the mesquites. Anthony looked at the peak, a huge, stormy purple mass that shone with a crown of silver from the sunset. Somewhere nearby, a Mexican sang a wild, sensuous Spanish love song in a haunting melody. "I knew another man here," Anthony said, his words echoing in his own ears. "His name was Collishaw. What happened to him?" "Collishaw? I'll never forget him," the old man said grimly. "Last I heard, he was cheating Native Americans out of water rights over at Walter's and still looking for someone to hang. That Collishaw was a Texas sheriff." Suddenly Anthony bent down so that his face was level with Singleton's. "Do you remember me?" "Well, I sure don't, stranger," the other man said. "I've been in the West for nearly 50 years, and I've never seen anyone like you before. If I had, I'd never forget it." "Singleton, do you remember the kid who shot off your fishing line one day? Do you remember how you took an interest in him and told him about Western ways and how he had to be a man?" "Of course I remember that kid," Singleton exclaimed bluntly. He was old, but his mind was still sharp. "How do you know about him?" "I am Anthony Fraser." The old man's eyes grew piercing. He stared intently, leaning in closer with a thrilling expression that showed his experience. "I know you now. It's Anthony. I would recognize those eyes anywhere. They're eagle's eyes. Once seen, never forgotten. And just look at you, you make me feel young again. I've never forgotten you, Anthony. Shake hands with old Singleton." Agitated and with trembling hands, Singleton grasped Anthony, almost embracing him, his old face lighting up with joy. "It's good to see you, to learn that you've not forgotten me all these years," he said with a tremulous voice. "You were like my own," Singleton continued. "But who would ever know you now? You have white hair, Anthony, and I see the desert in your face." "Old friend, have you ever heard of Wansfell?" asked Anthony. "Wansfell? You mean the wanderer the prospectors tell about? Of course, I've been hearing tales of him for many years," Singleton replied. "I am Wansfell," Anthony said with conviction. "So help me God, you, Anthony, the kind lad. Didn't I tell you what a hell of a man you'd be when you grew up?" Anthony drew Singleton aside from the curious onlookers. "Old friend, you are responsible for Wansfell, and now before I go I want you to take me to my brother's grave." Singleton stared in shock. "What? You mean Carl Fraser's buried here? That's why you came back?" "Yes," whispered Anthony. "I came to see his grave, to make my peace with him and God, and to give myself up to the law." "Give yourself up to the law?" Singleton gasped. "Have you gone mad?" "No, I'm right in my mind," Anthony replied patiently. "I owe it to my conscience, Singleton. 14 years of agony. Any punishment I may face here will be nothing compared to those long years. It will be a relief to surrender myself." Singleton's thin jaw shook as the shock and worry left his face. A glimmer of understanding began to emerge. "But why do you want to surrender?" he asked. "I told you, my conscience, my need to make things right with myself, to pay for my crime. What did you do, and why?" "Old friend, you've lost your sharpness," replied Anthony, "because of my sin." "And what was that, Anthony Fraser?" asked Singleton sharply. "The crime of Cain," replied Anthony mournfully. "Come, friend, take me to my brother's grave." Singleton was stunned. "Your brother's grave? Carl Fraser's grave? Good Lord, I wish I could take you there. Anthony, you're delirious. You're insane. Bless you, boy, you've made a terrible mistake. You're not who you think you are. You've been hiding in the desert for 14 years. You've gone through hell. You've become Wansfell all for nothing. My God, to think of that. Anthony, you're not a killer. Your brother is alive and well. He wasn't even badly hurt. No, no, Carl Fraser is alive, alive, alive." The end. This concludes Barren Horizon, a Western novel. Written by Ken Cannon. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for updates on the availability of new books and a special free offer.